So the question for the video today is politics making us crazy? And I'm only being a little bit sarcastic about that because this actually is an issue that I'm somewhat concerned with. I'm looking at the country as I see it right now, and there are a percentage of people, particularly on the left, some on the right also, but particularly on the left, who their perception of the world is based entirely in fear. They fear that they are actually moving into some type of a totalitarian government. That the Trump administration people are literally Nazis. Of course, most people don't know what the definition of a Nazi is, and for one thing, it's the National Socialist Party, but we won't get into that. But it doesn't change the fact these people are terrified. They actually fear that they're seeing the end of their nation. I don't think this is a majority of people, but my problem is that how much is it? I mean, I think on the right, it's a very small proportion. There was greater during the Obama administration. In the second term of the Obama administration, a lot of conservatives were concerned about what was going to happen in that administration and could the United States survive 4 more years of Barack Obama. Well, congratulations, we did. And I think a similar situation in reality with Donald Trump. But it doesn't change the fact that now there's a group on the left, and I think this is being fed by the media, because the media is constantly harping on negative issues. I mean, if you listen to the media, you think the United States is in one of the worst times in the history of this country. Both black unemployment and Hispanic unemployment are in record lows. The economy is growing. I mean, it's economically it's a good time, but you wouldn't know that from listening to the news. And I'm not going to come here and say Donald Trump hasn't created this to some extent, because he is an antagonistic type of person. If someone comes at him, he comes back. He punches back if he's hit. He's a salesman, and he's more interested in persuasion sometimes than in the truth. But the problem I'm looking at this is that people who are especially, and I have friends who are on the left, and I have family members on the left, and I'm actually somewhat concerned that they've created a level of fear in their perception of the world that is putting them under a sustained level of stress. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have researched what I'm talking about here, and I'm putting it forth as a hypothesis. I have taken plenty of psych courses, but I'm not a psychiatrist. Okay? Now, stress is a normal part of your life, and so is the response that happens. I mean, stress is created by fear or anxiety, and we're hardwired to react in certain ways. I mean, our heart beats faster, the blood pressure increases, adrenaline and cortisol, which is the stress hormone, all come into our systems, and they make us stronger and faster and more alert. They heighten our senses, they heighten our memory functions, because they're part of the survival instinct of the human animal. And most animals have a very similar response when dealing with a stressful or fearful situation. Now, the problem with this is that this is meant to be done for a limited amount of time. And what happens is, if an individual stays in a stressful environment for too long, then it will create what's called toxic stress syndrome. Now, this is it's very easy to see this when you're dealing with children. Children who are in stressful environments, they come from environments where their families are fighting, or we're talking about drug abuse or crime and all that. It affects children tragically. But it also has effect on young adults and on older adults also. And you get to a point where you're dealing with what would be considered a toxic stress level. Now, toxic stress isn't as much about the cause of the stress, but about the chronic and ongoing nature of the stress that you're putting yourself under. Again, everyone has experiences stress. It's a normal part of a healthy life. And we move through those stressful periods. But if you stay in a sustained environment of stress, it can affect your brain chemistry. It can affect your physiology. Particularly the regions in the brain is the amygdala, which is it's not, people think amygdala, but it's kind of a large section in various parts of your brains. And it has a lot to do with fear reactions and emotional levels in the brain. And the other part is the hippocampus. Now, these parts of the brain are vital for learning and for memory and for processing stress and emotion. A young developing brain, like a child who's in this environment, those connections can be damaged by, and particularly harmfully by toxic stress. Now, when the brain is constantly exposed to this toxic environment, it will shut down to try to protect itself from the environment. The brain continues working, but the rate of growth will slow down, and it will create a higher level of vulnerability to emotional states like anxiety and depression, and you become less resilient to stress. Now, very noticeable in children. The effect is much less in adults. And you're saying, well, Professor Arms, where exactly is the stress coming from? And the sad part about it is I think the stress is being created by individuals themselves. I think they're allowing themselves to be in a constant state of stress. I mean, the administration's been in office for 2 years now, and people are 2 years of being afraid. I'm beginning to think that it's actually affecting them. Because again, toxic stress affects people in all stages of life. The long-term effects differ depending on the age of the person and the stage of brain development, and how long and when you're exposed to the stress and other matters like that. The younger the brain, the more damaging the effects of toxic stress. I mean, in children, it is very harmful. It makes them incredibly vulnerable to chemical influences, such as the stress hormones, because they're smaller and they're growing. But again, it isn't just children that are affected by this. In late adolescence and early adulthood, the exposure to toxic stress will create a greater sensitivity to anything stressful and a more intense and enduring stress response. So literally you become stressed, and the more you become stressed, the more likely you are to become stressed. The more you're likely to become willing to deal to the negative emotions. Exposure to toxic stress during adulthood will intensify the aging process and affects your memory and the cognition and your ability to deal and handle with emotions. So the point is, so if the threat response is continually triggered both in adults and children, they will develop a hypersensitivity to the threat. And this will play out with a tendency to misread ambiguous and non-threatening situations as threatening, and it's a greater likelihood of sensing anger and hostility whether it's present or not, and the likelihood of being in a constant state of high alert, and even in the absence of real threat or stress. And most people would be aware of this in the concept of what's called PTSD, especially people who come from military situations. They end up in a hyper state of alert because of this. And this is what my hypothesis is. What I'm putting forth here is: are people allowing themselves to live in fear to the point where they're actually can't find a way to get out of being in the fearful state? Because I'm looking at the same environment that most of these people are looking at. And again, I did not support the presidency of Donald Trump. He's president of the United States. He's the president. I support my president. That's just the way that I am. You know, I supported Barack Obama. I didn't agree with all his policies, but I supported him. But I'm concerned about people are allowing themselves to be emotionally and even physically and mentally harmed by the levels of stress they're subjecting themselves to. And I mean, just a few days ago, a 30-year-old man tore a hat off of a 16-year-old boy in a restaurant, threw soda in his face, ripped his hat off, and left with it. I mean, that is not the reaction of a normal human being. And apparently ended up being, he lost his job and he has now been arrested. Well, congratulations, that's assault. You're not allowed to do that in addition to theft because you stole the object from him. The boy was wearing a MAGA hat. It's just a hat, folks. It isn't, you know, it is not, Make America Great is not a swastika. And the humorous part about that is you have people who are yelling about everyone being Nazis, and they're wearing they have the hammer of sickle of communism on their apparatus and flags and clothing, and that's communism responsible for 100 million dead in the 20th century. So I wouldn't exactly be wanting to be allied, you know, being thought of in the same category as Joe Stalin. Somehow, is that any better than being in the category of Adolf Hitler? Really? Research has found that even when adults who've been in a long-term abusive environment, that they still have a greater tendency when removed from it to react more violently and more harshly to everyday problems, arguments, traffic, disappointments. They get a heightened stress response. And this can cause trouble for, of course, relationships. Because it undermines your physical and mental health. The abuse doesn't have to be too severe to even have this effect. Physical abuse or psychological abuse, even mild or moderate severe, will reset the stress response to high very quickly when a person has been in one of these stressful environments. And I'm not proposing it as an expert. I'm not Jordan Peterson here, or somebody who really knows what they're talking about psychiatry. But I have a decent understanding, and I formed an hypothesis, and I'm wanting to put it out for people for their consideration. That you might want to think about that when you're dealing with people who, when they disagree with you, they immediately call you a Nazi. Well, you're probably not dealing with someone you want to deal because you're not dealing with a reasonable human being. And the question is this level of politics, is this level of fear induced by politics creating people that are unstable? I mean, a lot of people think, well, you just need we need to have common courtesy. We need to be more polite to each other. Well, that's a wonderful idea with people that you can be reasonable with. But I'm coming to the point now, I look at some of the things and I see news pieces and I see, people throw a 30-year-old man throwing soda in a boy's face, for goodness sakes. This is a big guy too. I mean, this kind of reactions are not acceptable. And I wonder, is this man has the stress simply got to him to the point where he is no longer has a true grasp on reality? When Trump was elected in 2016, a massive amount of people, a third of the people in this country, hit a state of cognitive dissonance. Their minds literally had to embrace something that they did not understand. And a lot of them became fearful. And that raises their stress level, and I'm wondering, is it now affecting them in the long term? And I'm not just saying, well, Democrats are crazy. And I'm going, that's not the point. I've seen this on the conservative side. I just notice it at this point much more prominently on the left side. And again, I believe because it's being fostered and encouraged by the media in the United States. It would really be nice to have a press that is interested in putting forth the truth and holding the powerful in check and revealing the light of truth on matters, so we as Americans could make our own decisions. Now maybe I'm being a little bit too simplistic, and maybe I'm wanting for something that doesn't exist anymore. To sum up in the end of this video, I'm concerned about the fact that fear is creating a stressful environment that is making people respond in irrational ways. When someone disagrees with you, if you're immediately willing to put them in the category of some of the worst human beings in the history of the world, I mean, the National Socialists, that, Hitler's followers, they are some of the worst people in the history of the world. I mean, other than you can go to Joseph Stalin's side, and this, and the Soviets, every bit as bad, killed a lot more people. But still, these are some of the worst people in the world. If you're willing to say, you are among some of the worst people in the world because you disagree with me, then what recourse do you have at that point? And this is what I'm concerned about. People allowing their fear to make them irrational to the point where all they have left is violence. If you have a disagreement and there's no way to negotiate, then you have to either separate or you have to fight. There isn't any other solution. And I'm seeing too many people fighting and being irrational. And I'm granted there are some on the right. I'm not giving the right, carte blanche on this. But I see it a lot more on the left because, again, I believe it's being fostered and facilitated by the media in an effort to sustain its flagging ratings and to pass along whatever agenda it thinks is important. All I want people to do is lighten up. Think about the people that you're dealing with. They're human beings just like you are. And you might find out if they didn't have a MAGA hat on, you might agree on 90% of things. because most people are exactly that way. And it's the same sort of thing on the other side. If you're looking at somebody who's got one of those pink pussycat hat things on, then yeah, maybe you don't need to hate them immediately. It's just a different point of view. And the way to settle that is with elections. And the way to settle that is to vote. I mean, if you don't like the situation, if you don't like the laws, if you don't like the situation on the border, which you shouldn't, it's a mess, fine, then elect people to fix it. Get them to pass laws to change the policies in the way that they need to be done. If you don't like a situation with the Constitution, fine, put an amendment in the Constitution. It's been amended over 24 times. It can be amended again. You're living in one of the greatest the greatest nation in the history of the world. It's a bastion of freedom for the world. The immigration issue is a classic example of this. There aren't any people trying to flee the United States to go to El Salvador or Nicaragua or Mexico or Africa or Asia or anywhere else where you're getting refugees in the world. They're all coming to the United States. You need to think about that. People living in this country thinking somehow they're in a horrible place. Well, I can tell you, feel free to travel to about 3/4 of the world, and you're going to find out that you're going to be really happy that you were here. Well, those are some of my concerns. And again, food for thought. I'm not saying I have the definitive answer on this, but I do think it's something that's probably worth considering. So, is politics driving us crazy? Perhaps a little bit, but as long as we're aware of the fact that it can be driving us crazy, maybe we can handle it in a more reasonable manner. Remember that we're all Americans, and that ultimately we're all in this together, and that America has survived civil wars, world wars, Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. So if we can survive those presidents, we can survive anything. Thank you for your time.
If you wish to join the quest for knowledge, the battle for truth, please hit the like button, recommend my channel to others, and of course, subscribe. Thank you kindly.